Hello, in this video I'll be talking about the approaches that are known to work quite well in understanding user requirements. So the approaches for capturing user requirements. What are these user-centered approaches? Here these approaches help us to understand, or let's say focus on, what the user needs to accomplish with the system. So that is the question that we ask ourselves to understand, as a starting point, understand user requirements. So we shouldn't be asking the question. So that's a kind of a trap that I thought I should mention it at the very beginning, that the question of what the user wants to do with the system, or wants system to do, what the user wants system to do type of product-centered approach is not a good idea. So you'd be rather, in this case, you would have a very much like a kind of inside-out perspective. So what do I have, and how can this serve, instead of adopting that kind of an inside-out perspective. We should have outside-in perspective. We should first try to look at the functionalities from users' perspective and ask ourselves the question of what does the user need to accomplish with the system. That is important. Okay, that's the question. So what do we do? What do we achieve by focusing on the users? It helps us to understand the necessary functionality. Again, avoids implementing features that will not be useful for the user, and it also assists us with the prioritization. To understand which is more important than the other stuff. Okay, and there are basically right now two methods that we can, or techniques, approaches if you like, that we know are working quite well in practice. These are the use cases and user stories. Okay, so what I'm planning to do in this module is not to go into the details of how use cases work or how user stories are, but it's just a very brief, if you like, introduction about these concepts, just to make you familiar with these and how they work. But I would advise you to look at other sources about use cases and user stories. Particularly use cases, you must know that many of you, I know that you are quite familiar, let's say, with the technique of use cases. Then that's fine. But what I would like to emphasize more on are the strengths and limitations of using these techniques, or the things that you should be very careful about. Let's start with the use cases. Again, very briefly, you describe with the use cases the task that the user will need to do with the system. Okay, not just like what does the system do, but what the user will do with the system. That's the kind of perspective that you should approach your solution. So it communicates the system's functionality and behavior to the customer or end user without revealing the internal structure. That's important, without revealing the internal structure. So it doesn't go into details of how the system will implement something or will respond something. It's a completely another issue. It's a design concern, not your concern, not users' concern. So users do not care about how that particular algorithm works and bring that thing. He or she just wants that thing here in the user interface. That's it. Okay? So don't go into the domain of the design. Stay in the user's domain. What are the examples? Quite many examples can be given here, like customer withdrawing money from the ATM machine is a very typical use case. Okay? Register for a course, use case. Place an order, use case in a web-based environment. Reserve a room, check in, check out are all kind of nice use cases that we can identify for different systems. Or request an elevator. Usually it starts with a user trigger. Something is triggered in the system does something, and you might have different let's say several back and forth message exchanges, and finally the system responds, and that's it. And a user a particular goal of a user will be satisfied. So that is not very easy, I must admit, to come up with a, let's say, a description of what a use case is that would be sufficient as a starting point for you to identify a use case. The best way is to show you examples and let's say and prepare you or make you a little bit more aware or experienced with that. I think let me put it this way: looking at the examples, I think, would definitely be helpful in teaching and guiding you in identifying use cases for a particular system. In your case, in your assignment for your solution system. For an online shopper, you would see more examples here. What we do with the use cases, in fact, I mean, I'll show you the details of a use case, but what you do is that you combine all these use cases in a use case diagram, as I have just I have mentioned about these use case diagrams in a previous video. Learn how they work. Again, this is just a very simple example here. We have 3 users and 4 use cases. So a student is obviously, this is what a student would do, should be able to do with the system: register it to a course. A lecturer, assign a co-lecturer, for instance, is something that a user must do. And apparently administrator should be also able to, or will be, should be also able to assign a co-lecturer for a particular course. But apart from that, administrator should also assign a lecturer or register a user, and so on and so forth. It just shows the main use cases and who can do these use cases. Of course, it's a very simplified version. Go and check the more advanced version of use cases where you have inheritance, relationship between the user, extends the relationship between use cases, and again, generalization or specialization relationships between the roles. More examples of use cases. I just wanted to show you some more examples, again, with the hope that they will inspire or help you at least to come up with better defined use cases for 3 types of systems here. Detailing, how would you detail a use case? Let's do an example. So a very good practice would be is to put a user and a system like side by side, like the case here. If you go through a definition of a withdrawal of a cash from an ATM machine, for instance, in this case you would see an actor and system on side by side. Here, actor, we are talking about end users just using the ATM machine, and on the other side we are talking about the ATM machine itself, the system, the software system of the ATM system. So what you see is a kind of numbered sequence of tasks that is performed by the user and by the system as a response. Many cases you would start you would see that the use case is triggered. The normal flow is triggered by the user by in this case, for instance, inserting a bank card into the card reader of the ATM, and then a series of actions are performed. And then usually you would also see that but anyway, so what is very important here that you would not see in the part where the system activities or responses are listed something that tells exactly how that response is being generated by the system. This is out of the scope of a use case diagram. Okay, so it dispenses the cache. How it dispenses is a design concern. It's not your concern. It's designer concerns or programmer's concerns, if you like. Designer in this case, because it also involves hardware and software. So I mean, God knows what. No, forget about that. So we don't know how, or we don't care. We don't care how that cache is dispensed from the ATM machine. We just want that thing to be dispensed. That's what we need. What is next? What do we do later on once we have this normal path, or sometimes also called a happy path? We have to go and check the alternative paths, which are like, first of all, alternative flows and the exceptional flows. The difference between these two is as follows. Alternative flows would still lead you to a kind of successful end. Exceptions, this is not the case for the exceptions, so you will end up with a kind of inferior situation or a state with the exceptions. Okay, so alternative flows, for instance, in this case, if there's a non-standard amount that's required, the user just should be able to like dial the exact number of the exact amount that he or she would like to get from the ATM machine. That's a kind of an alternative flow. It's a kind of a routing a bit away and then coming back to the normal flow, or received as required again. It involves an additional activity at the end. But in the exceptional cases, the end result is not something that we would want to get to end, let's say, to reach. That's the difference between alternative flows and exceptions. But here in the exceptions, we should again be careful not to involve like kind of details, design items. So we are still in the user domain, right? Not in the design domain. Next steps for the use case diagrams. You go over different scenarios of how users might interact with the system, and again, a scenario is just an instance of a use case. So in that sense, a use case can be considered to encapsulate a number of scenarios. Okay? Each path that a particular user follows is a scenario. You just go through the scenarios to find out if a use case description is sufficient. And what you can also do is, I show you, we have seen this kind of actor and system interaction. It's nice. An alternative way is to use, for instance, UML activity diagrams that show how the interaction will take place. That's also another way to detail a use case. But what a use case definition what should a use case definition involve or cover? We're talking about users, so you need to define who are the intended users or actors of that particular scenario. Preconditions, under what preconditions that you can talk about the triggering of that particular use case, the normal flow, the alternative executions, exceptions, and the post condition. So what condition you would expect the system to be at the end of the use case under different conditions, and under exception situations and under normal conditions. So these are the kind of 5 core elements that make up a use case definition. Okay, so that's not enough. I would very, very strongly suggest you to check the handout on use cases and class diagrams. There's a handout for that is in assignment C, as a part of assignment C. And also, I would also suggest you to check the chapter 8 of the book by Wiegers and Betty to get a better understanding and a better kind of idea about how use cases work. Good, so user stories. Short, simple description of a feature told from the perspective of the user who desires the new capability. User stories and use cases are quite similar, I would say, in the sense that a user, conceptually they refer to the same type of idea. Okay, so a use case, you can write a user story for a use case. It's one-to-one. But the way that you define the detail that you incorporate into your definition differs in the user stories and use cases. Use cases are really quite detailed descriptions, typically, often, detailed description of a particular set of actions of a system, but this is not the case for user stories. Essentially, this is something, user stories are used mainly for, or in the projects which adopt contemporary agile techniques. So we'll talk more about these agile techniques in another module, system development lifecycle or paradigms. module, so you'll hear more about them. But agile techniques like Scrum or XP heavily use user stories, and you follow a template there. What you do is basically you define for each user story, this is the template basically here, as a type of user I want some goal so that some reason. Let me show examples, because otherwise it doesn't make much sense. Let me close myself here. So if you're talking about an online bookstore, for instance, a use case would be update customer profile, and then you go and define the details of that thing. If you're adopting properly adopting a use case approach, if you follow an agile approach, and if you would like to continue with user stories, what you would do is to come up with such a sentence: as a customer, I want to update my customer profile so that future purchases are built to a new credit card number. That's a user story. Again, airport check-in kiosk or accounting system, you'd see more examples of such user stories here. And the question is, so what? So I mean, you have these user stories. What are the next steps for these user stories? They're not much, I must say. So not much in the sense that you don't define too much details about each user story. They mainly act as a placeholders for future conversions among the product owner, communications among the product owner, which are customer representatives and business analysts and developers. So what you do basically, let's say mainly in agile projects, you take a particular user story and then you work with the users. You sit down with the users, in fact, and then define what exactly this means. So define the details, but you don't have to document them. You don't document them like the way you do use cases. You just communicate such kind of normal paths or exception paths or alternative paths there in that particular session. You don't document them, you just try to implement them right there. So, and this is a kind of property of the agile projects as well, that the details of the requirements are elicited through user communication, but they are typically not documented. There are a lot of debates going on between, between the traditional and contemporary, let's say, schools of thought about whether the requirements should be documented or not. Depends a lot on the context. But not documenting the requirements in a proper way and keeping them at that level are also proven to be a very bad idea under certain conditions. Those conditions will be discussed in the separate module about agile techniques, contemporary agile techniques, I think in the next module. It's a known fact that it's very hard to keep thousands of user stories well organized in large projects particularly. So you need special techniques for that. So finally we are here at the strengths and limitations. Let's start with the strengths of user-centered approaches, use cases. They are quite, in fact, powerful, and they are heavily used in almost all projects. You see use cases or user stories being used, okay? So know how to use them. Use case diagrams can clarify scope and provide a high-level understanding of the requirements. So if you see a use case diagram, it will give you a very, very good idea about what functionality you would expect from this system. So it's a very nice input, very powerful. Use case descriptions are easily understood by the stakeholders due to their narrative flow. The inclusion of a desired goal or outcome ensures that a business value of the use case is articulated. The objective is, as I mentioned, you ask your question of you start with the question of what should the user do, or what should a user do with the system. You look at it from that perspective, and that perspective ensures that whatever you propose is of some value to the user, instead of going from the other way around. So this system has this, should have this, and that, and that. So it answers the question of why Why should this particular feature be there in your system? And without that why, you may go quite crazy and you can come up with some features that are mainly meaningless and will not be used by the user. So it is, at least it's helpful. What else? Use case descriptions articulate the functional behavior of a system, which will come back when you're discussing about the limitations, because that's also a limitation in some sense. And again, a strong point is that, let's say, at least some may also consider it as a weak point, because we'll see. They are very powerful. They are quite useful techniques for the development of business applications, websites, or mobile applications, and such, or systems that let users control a piece of hardware. Okay, with a lot of user interaction, but and it comes there. They might be inadequate for systems that do not have very rich user interaction. Okay, so like computationally intensive systems, business analytics, dashboards, data warehousing type of systems. It's very difficult to, or embedded systems, real-time systems. Sometimes it's difficult to use case diagram or use case representations to cover the real functionality. Okay, so car wash system, just an example. User goal would be wash the car. It might be there's just a single user goal. It would be definitely limited to direct the requirements. Okay, so because several motor sensors, pumps, dials, and have to work together to enable that thing. Of course, I mean, I'm not going into design of the solution. I'm still in the user domain, but just wash the car, just drive the car, bring it to the car place, and that's it. I mean, from the user's perspective, that's you can't go forward that much. So you need other type of techniques to be used here. Another thing we mentioned as a strong point, that the user story is focused mainly on the functionalities. So what kind of features will the system have eventually? But what we miss here are the non-functional requirements, and particularly the quality requirements. Okay, so I mean, it says that the student will be able to register a course, but it doesn't say anything about the performance, anything about the reliability of that system, or the integrity of that system, or usability of that system. So if you need to click 50 buttons to be able to register, does this feature supported by the system? Yes. Is it usable? No. So you will not be able to, let's say, infer proper, or there's a chance that you will miss that kind of quality aspects of the system by focusing too much on the use cases. So use cases, fine, use them, but they're not enough. Know that at least. And that's why we have a separate module about quality requirements as well. So I have just mentioned about that. Be careful with the as-is and to-be scenarios. So it is sometimes possible that you're trapped with the as-is and you don't see the to-be. I mean, you just like look at the current systems and you just focus on the to-be. You depict the normal flow of the as-is situation and miss the chance that, or miss the point that there should be a kind of follow-up for the to-be, or the to-be should be completely different. So it is not clear. So there is some sort of a how to put it. So there is some sort of a. I mean, you can easily with the requirement, with the use cases, you can easily go too much into the details of the functionalities and miss the point. So I mean, there is no kind of a proper guideline that will help you to say, hey, that's enough for this particular use case. And that's a kind of limitation of the use cases as well. So you can really dig down into the very small detail about this, about what the system, about a requirement. So you can just leave it at a very high level. Both are fine. That's also the problem. So it depends on how you want to use the use cases in the next phases of the requirements or system development. So there are some notes, there are some good practices about that as well, and I have already put some notes about how you can use cases, how in what ways you can use cases and incorporate them into the next phases of the requirements. So there are different type of options, and you will see more about these discussions in the assignment notes, in the template, I think, of the assignment C, the template document. Basically, you can leave at a very high level and define things later on in natural language, or you can really define them in a huge detail and in such a level of detail that they become solution requirements later on. So these are just two extreme options. Oh, this module turns out to be something quite long. I apologize for that. In fact, perhaps a better idea would have been to cut them in pieces, but it is what it is. That's it for this module, and yeah, good luck with your assignments.